Welcome to the Earn First podcast. My name is Arun Sudhaman, founding editor at Earn First. And joining us today, we have got Charlotte Mceleny, who's currently a freelance journalist and comms pro, but many of you will know her as a experienced marketing media journalist, spent several years with The Drum in Singapore, including as Asia Pacific publisher. Before that was with a company called Haymarket. Charlotte, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, we're excited too. We are keen to hear what you're up to these days. You left the drum. I don't know when you left the drum. Was it last year? Sorry, not the drum. You left Media Monks last
Yeah,
year.
I went into the PR world, about 4 or 5 years ago after like 15 years as a journalist. Um, yeah, loved it. Yeah, I've been on both sides now. That's always a fun perspective. Um, and yeah, I think it's been an interesting time to kind of not only kind of be on the PR side, but also be, in at an agency after kind of covering the industry for a long time. So in relation to our discussion today, I think I've got a few different sort of facets of perspectives on this as we kind of dig into PR and comms and the agency world and kind of what's happening. Because there's been so much change over the last few years. So yeah, I love this industry. I love covering it, loving it, being in it. It's been a bit of a ride.
Yeah, no, I'm really hopeful that you have a different perspective. I think you must do. I always wonder, right? And you would know this, when you're outside and you're writing about these companies, and you kind of think, is this really what's happening? You don't always know for sure. And now, when there is so much change going on, I've never seen anything like it the last 12 months. Certainly from in terms of the public relations firms, at least. But then part of me is kind of wondering, how dramatic is it internally? So we'll get to that. Um, we'll start with holding groups, I think, because that seems like the best place to start. There seems to be so much going on um, in terms of how they're changing and evolving. Some would say that the holding group era is perhaps changing. I don't know if ending is too strong a word. You had spent a few years with Media Monks, which of course positioned itself as the kind of challenger, the disruptor to the traditional holding group landscape. Certainly from the public relations perspective, I would say the amount of change is I've never seen, and it does call into question whether holding groups are the best vehicle for public relations firms. But how do you see it from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the model's been challenged for years, hence the
Mhm.
likes of, your Monks, your Stagwells, all of these guys kind of cropping up and offering alternatives. Um, but I think in the last couple of years, with the emergence of AI and kind of all of these sort of huge shifts that we're all feeling ourselves, I think it's kind of accelerated some of those conversations that were already happening. Um, PR particularly has been interesting because I think the role that PR plays within those holding groups has, we were kind of joking before we said on there, like, some PR arms of these holding groups literally sit in other buildings and are kind of kept physically at a distance. So that whether PR has ever been integrated into that model at all is like a legitimate question here. It feels like with the WPP stuff, it feels like the easy route to kind of sort of break off that chunk. It's sort of because it's been less integrated. So I think then it places a big question back on, I think, the holding groups of like whether that integration has really um, happened. But I think for me, it's an interesting conversation because you've also got in parallel this conversation with AI of kind of PR having a bit of a resurgence of value, with like the role that journalism and kind of create, content plays in geo and things like that. There is kind of an opportunity again to integrate it better, and I think, rise the conversation of PR into the boardroom. So I think personally, I have this conflict with this holding group conversation because it's like, okay, on the one hand, has it been integrated? Is this an obvious way to break it up? On the other hand, is this a total missed opportunity to have a really interesting sort of strategic integration with marketing and PR. I think maybe both things are true. But yeah, for me, I think I do. I mean, I think maybe it's the journalist in me, but I'm always kind of looking at the optimistic side, and it's like, oh, that's such an opportunity for PR to have this moment. I kind of want to see better integrated PR with marketing. Um, yeah,
Most journalists I've come across are a little bit more negative than that, but I like it. I
yeah,
like it.
ever the
Um,
optimist.
Very interesting observations. The I think it is an opportunity actually for public relations for the reasons you've pointed out. That upstream shift towards the boardroom, um, towards areas where perhaps public relations can demonstrate more strategic importance is clear. And you're right. It does. You do wonder why the holding groups are less interested in that. But when you look at what they're investing in and what they're betting
Mm.
on, it does seem to be media buying. It does seem to be e-commerce conversion, technology in general, AI. Is there anything there that makes you think otherwise? And what does that mean for perhaps, all the creatives and the consultants that these holding groups have spent decades accumulating?
Yeah, we saw so Publicis has acquired LiveRamp, so that's like maybe a good kind of parallel on this. It's like you see one holding group trying to sell off its PR arm and what create some cash from that, and then the other side you see kind of these data companies being snapped up by another holding group, and ultimately the reason you would buy these data companies is part of this bet on AI, right? Like you don't have an AI you don't have good skin in the game if you don't have the data that underpins the AI, right, and the quality of that. So you can understand the strategic bet that they're making there, and then we're also saying that AI is kind of fueling this resurgence in value for PR. So again, there's another like interesting sort of battle there. But I think the challenge that PR has always had that the media and the e-commerce side doesn't sort of have is this measurement conversation. And one of the things that I think that's interesting with the holding groups and how they're kind of developing is, and again, in WPP's kind of announcements that it's making and how it's going to
Yes.
kind of refresh itself, this kind of move towards outcomes model. So the way that that would work is your client would say, this is how we want to grow, this is the sales we want to make, and you would underpin your entire agency model around that versus charging for time and assets and things like that. So it's a complete shift in the way that the agency would be structured. How you would pay staff would then have to be against these goals of around growth and sales and things like that. So it's a big structural undertaking at like a very basic level. And I don't think any of the agencies have yet got a big scaled case for how that would work, but I think they're working on it. And then it's like if you think about how does PR fit within that when the conversation around PR has always been quite challenged against measurement, particularly if you're equating it to sales. I think that's when it becomes very difficult for that value. We're anecdotally saying the case for PR moving upstream is because there's more value on journalism and how it sort of fits in. But yet, with that, still conversation isn't moving into, and therefore that makes a sale. So I think for me, that's where this is becoming disconnected for PR. It's a measurement conversation.
Yeah, really good point. Difficult to measure, difficult to value effectively in a holding group context. In fact, in many contexts, and difficult to scale as well, I would imagine, right? So at least with these, data and AI plays, I think they're much easier for a holding group to then kind of replicate that globally. If you look at what Publicis has been able to do, for example, and that seems to be where the opportunity lies. But surely that has an implication not just for PR, perhaps, for the creative agencies as well. Do you think perhaps that they're imperiled as well by the way the holding group model is evolving?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two parts to that because I think agencies have always, on the creative side, have always had a kind of dual job. It's the strategic part. It's the finding something that is the differentiator. It's the strategic, white space. It's kind of finding something surprising that makes you stop in your tracks on social or TV or whatever the context of it is. And then there's also literally creating the assets of creative to fit into those slots. So
Mm.
AI is helping that part, that sort of second part of the model,
Yeah.
where it's kind of
Right.
reducing the cost and the human need from a resourcing point of view for that. And that's very much like that's not a new thing. Agencies have been kind of figuring out how to do that for a long time, and you've got lots of startups in that space trying to kind of come into there and answer that challenge. And ultimately, that's filling a need as well, because if you think about all the different platforms that we've got from sort of social and audio, TV, um, it is quite the complicated job to create all of those assets in different
Yeah.
languages, like we're in APAC. So there's a
Yeah.
need for technology to do that, really. Otherwise, existing as a brand in that context is too expensive. Um, but I think the interesting thing is, like, where does this leave the strategic role of creative, and how do you price on that now? And then that goes into an interesting conversation, which for me as a journalist and someone who's interested in kind of content is, well, we've potentially got a lot of AI slop, and if who's kind of dictating what good is, who, like, for me, the just it goes to quite a deep level of trust and fact checking. But then also on the other side, it's like, how does AI find surprising things? I grew up in the 90s where TV ads were for me, like, the golden era of TV ads. And some of them were bonkers. Like, they just didn't make sense, and it was kind of art in a weird way. It allowed kind of creatives to be completely insane in those days. Um, whether those worked or not is another question, and obviously we're kind of better at optimizing for making marketing work these days. Back to the measurement conversation, but um, there's still a space for kind of weirdness and surprising, and AI doesn't do that. It kind of is going towards an average, or it's trained on
Yeah.
averages and commonality and things like that. So I think the big question that's unanswered in the industry is that layer of strategic creativity and kind of surprise, and PR does tend to sit in that arena in a lot of respects, because PR isn't, it's finding that space to kind of create a new narrative. Um and so I think there is this world where we will be able to articulate that value and charge for it probably better than we are now, but we're in a bit of a messy middle point, I think, particularly because of AI. So but again, ever the optimist. This is for me, it's an opportunity.
Well, there's a lot of opportunity, I think. I mean, it's well put. You can argue that for independents, independent firms, for example, this presents a huge opportunity. Of course, I think they're all grappling with a lot of challenges, unfortunately, at the moment, in terms of economic situations and political volatility and so forth. Um, and that shift to outcomes-based pricing, which I think WPP outlined at its AGM, very interesting. You do wonder how it's going to work, given not only how difficult that will be, but also WPP's own, cash position and the debt they have. Looking at the holding group landscape overall, what do you think of how Publicis has been able to kind of outstrip really all of its competitors? If you look at what's been happening, are we kind of moving to a situation where we have Publicis and then there's the rest?
A little bit, for sure. I mean, the gap that they have from a literal financial, like, value is an unbelievable gap now. Going to be hard, I think, for the others to recover in any short amount of time. But one thing I always think about with this is, and we've seen IPG and Omnicom merge as well. You've kind of everyone is we've got less and less options at that kind of scaled level. Um, and I kind of think, if I was what those holding groups might consider a kind of tier two or tier three client, still well in the millions and millions of spend, right? I would not be feeling very important. So I wonder if this then creates an opportunity for your Habas or your Stagwell or Monks, these players who have a bit more scale than an independent, and can make those sorts of very important, very scaled, large amounts of cash kind of clients feel a bit more important than if they were in a kind of bigger structure. But at the same time, your publicists, those guys, this kind of growth and the scale that they've got means they've probably got good prices and things like that. And everything is becoming increasingly driven by a conversation with procurement and finance. So there's
Yeah.
multiple layers, and it depends, I think, on what clients really want from that relationship with an agency. But yes, there might be a kind of need for publicists and those guys. But I don't. Again, I'm just such an optimist, Joe. Where's the opportunity? But yeah, for me, if I was kind of one of the smaller agencies, I would kind of be looking at that. Become client centric, make those clients, the most important clients you can get. And I think there's kind of growth to be had there. Um, I think that's sort of super interesting, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the question probably that persists is always, is that best accomplished within um, a publicly held structure? But that's quite a big question. Um, don't let Omnicom hear you refer to it as a merger. By the way,
Yes.
it's a takeover or an acquisition or however you want to frame it. It's not a merger of equals. Um, and just on your point on procurement, let's talk about that briefly because how do you see that impacting the CFO role? The fact that so many of the conversations now do seem to be um, so financially focused in terms of how these buying decisions get made. Do you see that changing the CMO role at all?
Yeah, 100%. I've spent the last couple of months through different projects speaking with CMOs a lot about the challenges that they're facing and kind of the gaps of their skills and things that they're kind of trying to find out. And one of the big themes that keeps coming up is, I guess, improving their ability to talk to their CFOs and to procurement at a level where they're talking their language and they can articulate, I guess, the value of the work that they're doing and things like that. But one of the skills gaps that comes up, AI is obviously a big topic, but the second one is kind of being able to talk at board level about the financial side of things, because I guess that's is coming to them as a pressure, um, but it's also, I guess, everything's changing so much. This move to outcomes is driven by that sort of structural change. I guess the agencies are responding to um, that need from they're pushing that down onto their agencies, which sort of shows that need. But yeah, in the conversations that I've been having, it's a gap. CMOs need sort of help and support understanding how to do that better, because they've got a difficult role. They're managing so many things, and they also have to talk at a level of a CFO at the same time. So it's a complicated role these days.
It's fascinating, actually, because that's always been, as you would probably know, it's been the perennial bugbear in the comms world. If you talk to CCOs, corporate comms heads, it's always about how do we demonstrate our value in terms that the boardroom can understand, but not dumb it down to something like AVEs. Um, and yet, the feeling has always been, I think, on the comms side of the fence, that CMOs have had an easier ride in this regard because they're able to connect their work more easily, perhaps, to sales or to conversion. Um, but it sounds like it's not necessarily the case. Even CMOs are facing increasing pressure to demonstrate their commercial viability. Do you see that playing out in terms of job tenure and indeed how um, companies in general are viewing the CMO role?
Yeah, I think the job tenure thing is another kind of evergreen topic as well, right? Because I think the average tenure of a CMO is like 2 years or something crazy, and it's
Yeah.
not
Get
really
in,
long enough
win a
to see it.
win a can line, and get out. I think that's
Exactly.
the the cycle.
Exactly. Um, yeah, and I think that that sort of speaks to a lot of the challenges that the industry is having, because if your average CMO tenure is sort of 2 years, within that you're then expecting results within, I mean, and also back to the point that we won't dig into too heavily, but most of these sort of large scale companies are publicly traded, so you have to, um, you know, respond, report on a quarterly basis, and so you've kind of they're in this churn of quarter by quarter, proving
Yeah.
something that we know through looking at effectiveness studies and things like that, that's not really how things work at that kind of
Mm.
brand and kind of longer term level. Um,
Yeah.
so I think I think the challenge that CMOs have is that I'm going to reference a walk way of looking at this. They call it the twin pace principle. So they kind of say that marketers have to work at these two levels. You've got this kind of long term brand building part, and then you have this like quarter by quarter performance delivery side. So CMOs kind of live a bit of a split personality. They've got this long term creative brand, got to think at that level, because if you drop that, people will forget you in a year's time, and you'll kind of lose your share of market. But then we've still got to deliver quarter by quarter on a sales and performance point of view. So
Yeah.
I think it's challenging living in both of those worlds, and then being able to speak on both of those worlds to a CFO to explain that dual impact. For some brands, maybe that's easier because of what you say and how to sell and how you sell it. But yeah, it's a difficult, I think, headspace to be in. I don't envy CMOs; they have a lot of pressure. And add in the fact that they now have to be technical experts with AI and things like that. So
Yeah, absolutely. They have to demonstrate mastery and demonstrate what they're doing to automate their functions, which can't be easy. And we can't forget all of the external factors now. The economic environment we're seeing play out in different ways, but there's definitely, I think, an overall push to eliminate roles and eliminate functions.
yeah,
I saw Diageo, for just as one example, is I think getting rid of kind of the whole regional layer of
yeah,
functions, including marketing and comms. And I think the North American marketing head is the first significant casualty. And I can't imagine they're the only company that's looking at this. And we've seen this pendulum swing wildly in different ways, but it does feel like we're in a moment now where there's more pressure to remove some of these layers,
yeah. It feels
which
like it's
can
been going
only
on
add.
since kind of
Mm.
COVID.
Yeah,
I think the difference in this, it is cyclical, right? We particularly if you're I'm based in Singapore, where you usually have it's very tangible, that swing between the regional
yeah,
power and the local power, because Singapore is such a regional hub. So you
great
do have these
point.
periods of time in Singapore where suddenly those big jobs go, and you can see those people kind of leave, both at a kind of brand side level and at an agency side. But this time it feels different, because I think it's been happening since COVID, and the pendulum kind of hasn't swung back. So that regional layer hasn't been put back in. We're in kind of year 6 of that happening, whereas usually that might have resurfaced again, I think. We're one of the other, I mean, and then it's being echoed at agencies. I think Dentsu has been talking out there about that kind of shift from removing the regional layer. They've done it through rounds of, I think, restructures and things like that. But they're still talking about that as a kind of structure for them. It's like putting more power in the markets, and that's completely driven by the brands requiring that. So I think it is cyclical, but I do feel like we've been in this version of the cycle for quite a long time now,
Yeah,
and I'm not really sure if anyone really knows when that might come. That regional layer will be important again. Maybe, a bit like, yeah. I mean, surely it's going to come back again, but I don't know.
maybe, maybe not.
Mm,
Maybe it's structural this
maybe
time.
not.
At some
Yeah,
point, things change. It does feel like things, are everything is kind of up for grabs at the moment. I would never have, if you told me 12 months ago that, all these agencies were going to be merging and some would be up for sale, and, I would not have predicted it. So you can ask the question. It could be structural this time. Whether it's the right decision, I'm not sure. Right? I think these regional layers often do a lot. I know certainly at many comms functions they are invaluable, um, but they're difficult to
Well,
justify at times
to
like
your
this.
point, yeah, it's like that regional layer usually, particularly from a comms perspective, would be where you would have your senior advisory around important subjects
Yeah,
that would mitigate
exactly.
risk and uncertainty and really important cushioning layers for challenging times. So I think the
Yeah,
other thing that's kind of little hard to see the logic in is we're in this time that feels so unpredictable, so kind of fragile and crazy, and yet most companies have kind of removed that senior layer of comfort. They're
yeah.
they could be kind of exposing themselves to risk in some sense. So I think that's what kind of feels a little bit unpredictable about the industry as well. To your point, I'm not sure where it's going to go because the logic that you would normally apply to some of this doesn't quite
Mm.
sort of seem there.
No,
Um,
some of the decisions seem a little bit knee jerk, perhaps.
yeah,
Um, and you're right. I mean, even just in terms, if you think of the reporting lines, if you go from having local markets report into a regional head, and look, I know there's a lot of I think there's probably a lot of fat out there that can be trimmed. I'm sure there's good reasons for that, but you can't have all the local markets reporting into the US or wherever. I mean, that just seems so unwieldy. So it does raise some interesting questions. I think Dentsu is a really interesting case, perhaps a unique one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. There was a lot of talk that they were selling their international operations, although I saw there was a recent interview with the Dentsu CEO in campaign where he pointed out it was never confirmed that they were actually up for sale. But they've got quite a challenging set of conditions in terms of their numbers, in terms of their global network. And for them, you would think they actually need more senior talent outside the country, whether it's in regions or local markets. So I wonder how you see that playing out.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's one of the things I think it always comes back to for me with this conversation is, yeah, I think they probably do need more senior talent, particularly to kind of give or create the trust with clients and potential clients that, they're being sort of serviced outside of Japan and things like that. I think clients want to be serviced at that level locally so that they've got the talent that sort of corresponds with that.
Yeah,
But then the question is, are clients really willing to pay for that? There's sort of this chicken and egg on that.
yeah,
Um, I think and that's ultimately, I think, the place where the big holding companies are at. We've had this kind of race to the bottom a little bit on some of the costs from clients. And then it's sort of the pushback is, that you need talent here, you need talent there. And I think we're in a bit of a challenging moment where perhaps a tough question needs to be pushed back on CMOs. And then that goes back to the CFO conversation again, because I think a lot of CMOs probably know that they need to be at least keeping the budgets and keeping these agencies alive and don't want to see headcounts being reduced on their accounts and things like that. But the ask from the CFO is XYZ. So I think it goes back to this need for sort of literacy and empowering the CMO to have that conversation. But we have been, I think, economic situations have pushed it into that point. But yeah, so I think holding groups are in a bit of a difficult situation because I do think you need solid talent coming through to kind of help that regeneration for some of these guys, but it's like who's paying for that? But actually, I talked to a few recruiter friends recently in Singapore, and there are a few more senior roles coming into holding groups and things like that. So I think there's been obviously a big shed of talent. Like
yeah, a
it's not like
lot.
suddenly that not like suddenly they're going to
Yeah,
be recruiting hundreds of roles to make up for
no,
what they've shed. But I
mm,
think they're now in a point where this understanding what strategic roles they need to put back in place to kind of build that up. I mean,
Yeah.
if they, if those redundancy rounds, all of those things that the holding groups have been making were genuinely strategic, the point of it is to sort of strip back, remove the fat to your point earlier, but then look at like, okay, what talent do we need to move in the direction that we need to move into? So again, but maybe optimistic of me, but from the conversation I've been having with some recruiters, it does sound like some of those roles are starting to be put back, into the
That's good
market.
to hear.
Um,
That's good
yeah,
to hear. I think,
positive.
yes, positive, even though, I mean, I do wonder though about the whole model when, Omnicom is, I think, committed now to 1.5 billion in savings, cost savings
Mm.
from the interpublic
Yeah.
acquisition. Um, yeah. Anyway, let's talk about Cannes.
Yes.
Um, because that's
Talking
always
about
the
money.
industry's. Yeah, while we're talking about ROI, let's talk about Can. The industry's always the favorite topic. Do you think there will be more pressure this year? Do you think there's going to be fewer CMOs, or will they find a way, as always, to make it out there?
The challenge, there is a big challenge from an APAC point of view on it, which is it's it's more expensive to literally travel at the moment. Um, so like flight prices are insane. So I do think that'll probably, unfortunately, impact some of that. But I'm a big believer in people getting together in the industry, and Cannes is like the absolute gold standard of that. Um, and there needs to be represented. I want it to be the global event that it deserves to be. So it does need representation from APAC. It needs representation from South America and whatever. But when you go as someone who works in APAC, it's very evident that you're in the minority, like truly in the minority. There's not, I mean, there is some good attempts at doing APAC content from Lions Group generally. Walk are pretty good at trying to put stuff on, and then outside of there's usually some sort of fringe events and some of the other publications and stuff that are there do some bits and bobs. Um, but it would be good to see more APAC representation. But it's this year particularly, I think it's going to really harm it. It's too expensive. I'm not sure. I'm not. And it's become very American actually. I went 2 years ago and had had a gap before that. And it was very American. That was everyone talks about how the Crozet has been taken over by kind of tech companies, but for me, the American
It's how
accents. It
American.
was,
Oh,
yeah,
100%. I mean, my first Can was 2009, I think, um, which is always interesting because that was the financial crisis. And I think it was only about 50% attendance that year. It was a really crazy year. It also rained a lot. Um, but even then, if you look at the change between then and now, that's 17 years ago. Um, yeah, I know. It's really a long time. Um, certainly, if you look at the com sector, for example, the Americans didn't really turn up until 2013. The PR lines started in 2009, but the American agencies didn't really commit to it for 3 or 4 years. Um, and yeah, definitely you see much bigger American influence, and you see that playing out, I think, in the conversations as well, in the what people are talking about, which I think is a little bit of a shame actually, because like you said, it should be representative. It should reflect the breadth and depth of the industry. And one other thing I really noticed was the Chinese presence, which dropped off for obvious reasons during COVID, has not really recovered, I
no.
don't
They
think,
used to have
since
China
then.
Day. Like there was a
Mm,
specific day that, and I remember,
yeah.
like I think it was had like Tencent or Alibaba
Yeah.
sponsorship or something like that for a
Yes.
long time.
10 cent.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember all that.
Hmm.
Yeah, that hasn't really come back. It's just pockets
No.
of sort of sessions. And I don't know what that's driven by, if that's driven by like less APAC attendees, so therefore less, or it's, because I don't think it's, from, I know Lions put in a good effort into attempting to kind of address that balance. So I don't
Oh,
know
they've
what's
done,
driving
yeah. They've done a
it.
huge amount of work on diversity. You have to say
Yeah.
they've really made significant efforts to diversify Can, because again, going back 10 years, it was a very homogenous place, like the industry. And that's changed a lot. You have Inkwell Beach. You have a lot of they invest a lot, I think, in just taking people from underrepresented groups to Cannes. But it's quite difficult, I think, with Asia because you're talking about industry leaders who from this part of the world who are maybe not necessarily seeing the value. Certainly not from China. There is an interesting session I saw happening with, I think it's Xiu Ting from Singapore, who's leading a discussion on, I think, something to do with Chinese branding, which looks quite good. But yeah, it's kind of one-off sessions as opposed to a whole day. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I think yeah, I'm a big there will always be a question of like I think does this drive ROI for us. And it is difficult to do that when you're spending more from Asia, and it literally costs more to go there, and there's less content, so it is tricky. Much easier, I think, to justify if you're coming from London or even the US. Um, but yeah, I'm a big fan of moving the industry forward through getting together and
Yeah.
figuring stuff out. So um,
Yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
hope that we can kind of figure that out. And I actually think Spike's coming back this year as the kind of sister event to it, kind of properly. And I think the feedback from that was good. So I kind of see, and I think Asia just took a little bit of time post COVID to come back from events, even locally. So I think interestingly, it's just this delayed reaction and not being helped by the situations that we're in now.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and the
but
flights are just a mess as well, right? Because no one is to get to France from Asia. It's hard to avoid the Middle East,
yeah,
um,
I
and
did
that
see,
has yeah.
yeah, I did see a stat the other day, and this maybe comes back to this sort of CFO conversation again. I think it's like I did write it down because this is a good stat. So highly creative, award-winning campaigns, e.g., Canline, but can be any award-winning campaign, deliver a 51% increase on ROI. So there is
Is that from Walk as
arguably
well?
that might be from the Lions group, yes.
Ah,
Somewhere.
excellent. David
So
Tiltman will be
somewhere,
so happy with this podcast.
yeah.
We talked about brand versus performance, and we talked about effectiveness. This is yeah. He'll be very happy.
There we go. Well, and you guys have awards too. This is just bigging up the case for awards.
No
But
question.
the point of awards when you don't feel like it's too much of a commercial machine is that we get together and we decide what good is. And when juries, I think, take that seriously, which Cannes Lions obviously that's the jury is very serious there, but
Yeah.
other award shows when the jury is taking things very seriously, I think it's like a very important part of our industry because it's we get together. What do we stand for? What do we think is good? What are we putting on a
Yes.
pedestal? It's very important.
Yes.
It's
Preach. I
very
totally
important.
agree. I
Yes.
think I had I was speaking at an awards thing in Tokyo last week, the PROI Awards, and they asked me to say a few words about why awards matter. And again, you can get so jaded and cynical about it all, especially when you've seen how awards work and you know how much money they can generate, and you see all the category bloat and all of that. But from a comms perspective as well, I think there's so much negative coverage of PR. And awards is really one of the best ways to demonstrate how much good work the PR world does, and in
Yeah.
particular work that improves societies and helps organizations build stronger relationships with all stakeholder groups. That I don't think that happens without award show mechanisms.
No, the process of writing an awards entry, as difficult as it can be sometimes, is a very. I think the process itself is kind of important for people to go through. Yeah, to your point, there's category bloat. There are bad players where it's pay for play. Like there's reasons why awards generally have gotten that sort of cynical view, but when they're done well, you know, I think they're important.
All right, well, we'll leave you on that positive note, I think.
Positive.
which, yeah, indeed. So thank you so much, Charlotte, for joining the show today. And yeah, I'm very hopeful we'll get you on again in the not too distant future.
Anytime when you need some positivity.
We always need it. We always need it. Thank you so much. And a big shout out to our producers at Earshot Media.